Good afternoon. This is Professor David Weiss, once again speaking from New Jersey City University's Connecting Bridges and Borders podcast program, a program that reaches around the globe, providing a student enrichment and engagement for topics that cover politics, policy, art, culture, STEM, all in an effort to help advance the next generation and how they are change agents and contribute towards a betterment of society. We're on the road today at a place that itself is part of the fabric of New York City, the Players Club, enriched in deep history, supporting arts, culture, and the theater. In fact, I am personally proud to be a player. Today's guest is Miss Gabrielle Glaser. She is an award-winning author who has written numerous books, has been published in the LA Times, Washington Post, both on national TV and syndicated radio. Her recent book, which just came out, is known as American Baby: A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. Ms. Glaser, welcome to our show. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Thank you so much for having me.
So I really want to start out for our audience to understand the importance and significance of your work. But before we get more granular, can you please first tell me a little bit about yourself so our audience has an understanding of how you came to where your journey led you in this most important both research and really historical perspective of the adoption agency process in the United States?
I was a student of history and intended to get a PhD in Brazilian history between my master's. After my master's, I wanted to go on and get a PhD. And I took a break and got a job at the New York Times as a young person. And I really felt wedded and attracted to covering the present and the energy of oral history and interviewing people. And that's what led me to my work as a journalist and as an author.
And, with all of these young experiences that led to your becoming an author, I look at it as really storytelling at its best. What brought you to tell this particular story in this book?
Well, I was really drawn to the personal narrative of a friend of mine who had been adopted as an infant in New York City shortly after his birth in 1961, and his search to find his birth mother. He was surrendered for adoption into a New York City adoption agency and was adopted by people who loved him very much, but always wondered where he had come from. And at the age of 52 in 2014, he took a DNA test that led him to reunite with his birth mother, who had searched for him his entire life. And they were able to meet 3 months before my friend David Rosenberg died of some of the very illnesses that his mother had tried to warn him against his entire life.
And were these illnesses part of a search of a journey to find his mother, or more of a search to understand how his illnesses could possibly be treatable or treated, or a combination of both?
Combination of both. He was very interested in finding his medical history on behalf of his 3 children. He had married and had 3 kids. And as an adoptee, having been adopted in post-war America, adoption was secretive, it was closed, and adoptees, what really made me really want to investigate the story of my friend David and his mother, Margaret Katz, was that their single story, their twin stories, really was a stand-in for that of an estimated 3.5 million other young women who'd gotten pregnant out of wedlock and were forced to surrender their children into an adoption system. And of course, there are 3.5 million sons and daughters who were completely divorced from their original identities and also their medical histories.
I mean, it's an astonishing number of people impacted by this? Because what resonates here is not just the 3.5 million adoptees, but all of those that touched and crossed those paths, including the parents, grandparents, children that they may have had. What was the reason, the rationale behind this sort of adoption process that was created, according to what I read in your book, really started, we'll call it post-World War II era here in the United States as a middle class started to grow. How did this become what would appear to be happiness into such a grotesque, if you will, process?
So, in the years after the war, there was no birth control, sometimes even for married couples, until a Supreme Court decision legalized it in 1965. There was no sex education, abortion was illegal, and the sexual revolution was definitely simmering. And as a result, young women, without any knowledge, without any access to reproductive choice, found themselves pregnant. And they were forced and coerced into a predatory adoption system that operated as a business. And it was responding to the needs of an America that was really dead set on creating nuclear families. The nuclear family, as you know, in the years after the war, was completely fetishized. As Betty Friedan wrote, the only way for a woman to become anybody, to not be a nobody, was to have a child. And if you were unable to conceive, you were left out of this vast demographic wave that was the baby boom. You were suspect, you were seen as un-American, you were seen as somehow, potentially some sort of, you were definitely a nonconformist if you were unable to conceive. And there was no reproductive technology, or very little anyway at the time. And so the only way for couples who couldn't create a child of their own biologically turned to these adoption agencies, which operated as middlemen between young girls who were forced away into secrecy, into a series of maternity homes nationwide. They were told to forget their babies. They were told that they would go on to have children of their own one day. And the adoption agencies took custody of these sons and daughters and then played God, essentially, in placing them with the families they best saw fit for each particular infant.
Yeah, I mean, when I read the book, it was very disconcerting. And you raised this. First, you have this shunning, if you will. And it seems to be also a theme with the concept of the capitalistic nature of what is referred to, I think, in your book as the customer. Now, the question is, who was the customer?
Well, the customer were the adoptive parents. And I call it, in the book, the adoption industrial complex. The young women who were pregnant and without any choice were the means of production. The babies were the product. And as we just said, the adoptive parents were the customers.
It's very systematic in approach, at least the way you describe it.
We don't like to think of babies as being products. No. And certainly adoptive parents would be loath to have to, I think, put on the mantle of being a customer. But when you look at it with a very cold eye, there's really no other way to see it.
Where did, when I read this, the one of the central parts to this was, without giving too much away of the book, so that I encourage my audience to purchase and read this book because of its important, significant understanding of what's being discussed today. What this concept of science and mental health and predictability, what is referred to as the rubber band theory. Can you expand a little bit on that without giving too much up for obviously those to read the book and understand more in depth why they may have also been part of, we'll call it the stakeholder group in this systematic approach.
Sure. So the agency at the center of my book was Louise Weiss Services, and it was a very prestigious agency in New York City. In New York at the time, adoptions were arranged by religion. So the religion of the birth mother dictated the family to which the baby would go. And Louise Weiss was the Jewish adoption agency, and the two characters at the center of my book were Jewish, so I focused on that agency. You may remember it because it was at the center of the really horrific experiment that separated identical twins and triplets.
Right, that three-twin,
The
which
triplets,
was
identical triplets,
yes,
right.
yes.
So what Louise Weiss promoted itself as was the premier, not only Jewish agency, but really a science-based service that could offer you premium babies. And I actually found this in the archives. There were references in the minutes of the agency to being able to offer blue ribbon babies to blue ribbon parents. And by that, they meant that the agency would test the intelligence of a newborn in order to properly match it with, and I'll be just flat out honest here, the family of a doctor or a lawyer. You weren't going to send a baby that the Louise Weiss board of physicians thought was a dumb baby to a prominent attorney who operated on a sliding scale. Louise Weiss operated on a sliding scale, and wealthier parents paid a heftier fee in order to be on Louise Weiss's waiting list. So you can see where those wheels are turning.
Right, yeah.
And there was a pediatrician on the board of Louise Weiss who had a theory that the babies who were the most intelligent were those who cried the loudest. Well, how do you test the intelligence of a 10-minute-old baby? How do you test the decibels of its crying? You make it cry. And this pediatrician, who was a well-known, very well-respected pediatrician in New York City at the time, believed that he developed this test that shot very thick rubber bands at the bottom of a 10-minute-old infant's foot. And he and his researchers measured the cries of these babies. This experiment went on at least 7 times in the first 10 minutes of life and continued on up until the time a baby was at least 3 months old.
I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to assume that the ethical issues of this and the long-term potential psychological effects for a child, for what was a intended purpose in a scientific experiment on IQ testing, if you will, or intelligence behavior, really was, frankly, disturbing.
Barbaric. As far as I could see, there were no ethical questions raised at the agency. And I was really perplexed by this because in 1947, the United States signed the Nuremberg Codes, which was the post-war reaction to what had happened to Jews in the camps, the horrible experimentation we all know about.
Yeah, Dr. Mengele. And,
exactly,
yeah.
Separation, treating, experimenting on twins. And yet here was a Jewish agency, Jewish doctors, who were performing sinister pseudoscientific experiments on tiny babies.
It's very disheartening, but it's also putting aside the fact that they may have been Jewish doctors, but also you had institutions here and peer-reviewed articles that went on for decades. I saw in your book about, it was the American Science Journal, where many publications were done over the decades of this rubber band theory, but also institutions like Columbia University and Yale were participants in a number of follow-on studies. Is this a fair statement?
First of all, the United States government funded this study.
NIH.
Funded was the most generous financial backer of this study for 15 years, and actually it was performed at Long Island Jewish Hospital on Long Island. So Columbia University wasn't a part of it,
Okay.
But regardless, large institutions funneled babies, Catholic Charities, the New York Foundling Hospital, institutions that were at its heart were supposed to have human welfare first and foremost, right? First, do no harm. The Hippocratic Oath is the first thing a doctor takes when he or she graduates from medical school. But that seemed to be something that went by the wayside in the name of the adoption business.
Was it the adoption business or was it the scientific research, in your opinion?
I believe the scientific research helped fuel and justify the adoption industry's purposes.
You know, we have some students here with us today that want to ask you some pointed questions after also reading the book. Would you mind taking a few questions?
Of course, be happy to.
Our first question is from Taylor.
Hi, Gabrielle. After reading the story about Margaret setting out the early ages of the adoption factory systematic approach, as an author and scholar, how did this personally make you feel?
Thank you, Taylor, for that. I started out my research with sadness and curiosity about the twin stories of my two subjects, and I ended it pretty much with outrage.
The outrage that you felt, can you go a little bit deeper on what that means to you?
First, I was outraged by the treatment of young women. Then I was outraged when I discovered what had happened to so many babies. I was absolutely livid that the United States government had justified, had paid for, had funded these horrifically barbaric experiments. And I was even more deeply disturbed by the fact that it had been hidden. These studies are there. They're published in JAMA. They're published in the Journal of Pediatrics. But you have to go digging.
And it's in enlightenment, I think, in the world we live in today, as we sort of ask ourselves a number of questions, including questioning things of the past that have these sort of dark secrets in the name of science. You know, one of my other students has a question. Her name is Dana.
Hi, Gabrielle. As a woman, the happiness that adoption can bring for those who cannot have children of their own seem to have been corporatized throughout the decades. Do you think it still exists in this way?
Oh, Dana, thank you for that question. That is a really smart thing to ask. It is definitely something that is persisting, ongoing. There are very large adoption agencies throughout the United States, particularly in southern states, Texas and Florida, for example, that really market themselves. They advertise babies on the internet, and there's no recognition that adoption for an adoptee always begins with loss. That child has lost his or her birth kin and his or her connection to his or her family, and it is glossed over in this beautiful, lovely portrait of, oh, here, you were always the child who was meant to be ours. And we don't recognize that still as a society.
You know, one of the things that Dana brings up and listening to your response on this is, do you believe in present tense? And really it's an opinion-based question, but based on all, of course, the decades of work you've done in this field. And I'm curious is about human trafficking today. Does human trafficking correlate or transpose now into what was more of a 1950s and 60s process? And now the human trafficking has replaced that with babies that go to market for adoption?
That is a really serious question and worthy of a lot more discussion. Certainly there are, I will just say this, certainly I will tell you that there have been countries, the Netherlands is the most recent, earlier last month, just in February, I believe, Holland shut down all of its international adoptions. It just completely screeched them to a halt because of not only rumors, but evidence that many babies from Brazil, from Indonesia, from elsewhere had been trafficked. Large sums of money had been exchanged for those babies ending up in the Netherlands.
Yeah, I think for our audience, the concepts of this human trafficking shows from this discussion how the tentacles are deeper than just perhaps the original or maybe one's thought of, hijacking or taking one hostage, but how it really infiltrates into a systematic process that looks to be innocuous, but yet is very sinister, perhaps due to its origins in human trafficking. Yeah.
Due to its origins and due to its secrecy. Once you have an adoptee who is completely shut off from his or her original identity, that itself is trauma.
Yeah. We have one more question, and that's going to come from Sharia.
Hi, Gabrielle. After reading American Baby, I realized this is not just tragic in the story and narrative, but provides victimization and context throughout the years, even up till today. How are you able to emotionally deal with this?
Well, it wasn't always easy. I was angry a lot of the time that I was doing my research and that I was writing. But one thing that gives me hope is that in 9 states in the United States, adoptee rights activists have been able to overturn the secrecy laws and now have access to the original birth certificates that allow them to be able to find their birth kin, to allow them to be able to see what moment they were born and hold the actual piece of paper that tells them who they are. That fight is ongoing in 41 other states, but in Texas, in Minnesota, in Maryland, in Connecticut, and a handful of others, it looks that as though bills are about to go through, and perhaps this moment of national reckoning about our systemic social injustices is catching hold among legislators and the adoptee rights world as well. That's my hope.
So I'd like to get some parting words, if we can, on showing our audience, just like human trafficking today really plays or could play, as you pointed out, a role in the furtherance of this adoption agency process that has a lot of net negative effects and impacts. If we look at the science side, such as the rubber band theory of its day for predictability in placing certain children with certain families, certainly AI is something that will be used in every sector, in every field of science. So I'm not asking you to opine on AI, of course, but I would like to know that those that need to think about policy and standards in order to protect the innocent from what will be, we'll call it a warp speed in science for predictability. What could we learn from this to create those ethical standards?
Well, again, this is a conversation for another day, but one thing that is completely unregulated in the United States today is the world of assisted reproductive technology. It is the wild, wild west. And there is big money being paid for women who achieve a certain number on their SAT scores or go to MIT or Harvard for providing their eggs for a lot of money. Same with sperm donors.
So it's almost it's like layers almost of systematic approaches that almost remove any concept of family and replace it with almost a robotic process of efficiency.
how are you going to get the smartest baby?
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I want to thank you, Ms. Glaser, for taking time today to speak with us about a very important historical and real, I think, real life in terms of where we are today, especially some of the issues we brought up. I encourage my audience to read American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. Once again, I bid adieu. This is Professor Weiss on behalf of my students from around the world, and you, of course, signing off from New Jersey City University's Connecting Bridges and Borders until our next show.